Here we are on week number 3 of our distance learning. We have talked about some of the things that the processes of people trying to influence members of Congress. We've talked about Congress being a bicameral legislature, meaning it has 2 houses. We talked about that first house being the House of Representatives. And today I want to touch on what the other house, the second house, the upper house called the Senate, is all about. And so that's why we're here today to talk about this stuff. The Senate, if you remember, the House of Representatives has 435 people in it. It's based on representation and population size. The Senate is the other side of that conversation. We have 100 members of the Senate, 2 from each state, so it has equal representation. Of the 100 members, though, every 2 years when there's an election, only a third of the Senate is up for re-election. So 1 year it's the first third, 2 years later it's the second third, 2 years later it's the third third, 2 years later it goes back to the first third, and so on. Because of the fact that 2/3 of Congress is, I keep saying Congress, 2/3 of the Senate is always in session, it means that it is a continuous body where the House of Representatives, all 435 people, are up for re-election every time. So they start a new term every 2 years. The Senate is in its same session that from when it was created in 1789. So it's the same session, just obviously a lot of different people. For the Senate to take place, you must have something called quorum. Quorum means you have a majority of the people present. So if there's 100 members, a majority would be 51. As long as 51 people are present, you can hold and vote and discuss bills and such in the Senate. If you notice stuff going on with Corona, there have been some senators that have self-isolated themselves, including one from the state of Florida, that there was some difficulty in getting a law or a bill passed through the Senate, but it was eventually passed through the Senate because people came back from being their self-quarantine. They always had quorum, though, so they always could function. Much like the House of Representatives, if you're elected to the Senate, you can get reelected again and again and again and be there forever. There are no term limits either on the House of Representatives or the Senate itself. Originally, when the Senate was created, the state legislatures elected each member of the Senate. So the state legislature in Tallahassee would pick the 2 people from Florida that would represent Florida in the Senate. In the 19-teens, that changed with the passage of the 17th Amendment, that now popular election selects the member of the Senate, and the popular election is us, the people voting. We pick the Senate, our senators. The Senate is considered the upper house, and because it's the upper house, they have different requirements to become a member of the Senate. It begins with, instead of being 25 years old for the House of Representatives, you have to be 30 years old for the Senate. You have to live in the state that you are representing, whether you're in the House or in the Senate. If you remember, in the House, you have to live in the United States for 7 years. For the Senate, you have to live in the United States for 9 years. What we see is a lot of times people go into the House of Representatives for a few terms, and then they try to become a senator. They work their way up the food chain. The leadership of the Senate is a little bit different than the House of Representatives because it's a continuous body. They don't have one person that is selected like the Speaker of the House. What they do have, though, is the President of the Senate. And the President of the Senate is the sitting Vice President of the United States. So at the time of me recording this, Mike Pence is the President of the Senate. His only job, though, is to break a 50-50 tie. So there's the vote on something, and 50 people vote one way, 50 people vote the other way. The Vice President comes in as President of the Senate and casts the vote that changes that one way or another. In the event that the Vice President cannot be there, there's somebody called the President Pro Temp of the Senate. And their job is to work as the temporary pro temp, the temporary president of the Senate. And that goes to the longest serving member of the majority party. So right now, the majority party in the Senate is the Republican Party. Whatever senator who has been there the longest is the president pro temp of the Senate as it stands today. We talked last week with Congress and how they get paid. That remember, Congress gets to set their own pay, but with the 27th Amendment that changed. They can set their own pay, but it doesn't go into effect until the next election. There is one more thing I wanted to put in about compensation today. There's a non-salary compensation that gives a major advantage to the members of the House and the members of the Senate that are running for re-election, and that is something called franking. Franking is the giving members of Congress the ability to mail things for free. So flyers, during election, we get these flyers that come to our house from people that are running for office. Well, the people that are incumbents, remember the word incumbent? That means you're already in office. The incumbents get to mail all that stuff for free, so the money that they fundraise can be spent on other things, where a challenger has to spend it on the other things and the mailer. So it gives kind of an advantage to those people that are in office. I will tell you that members of Congress, when they run for re-election, typically win the re-election about 90% of the time. So pretty much if you're there and you want to stay there, there's a good chance that you're going to be able to win your re-election. All right. Now some powers. We've talked about last week. We talked about the different types of power, whether it was powers that were written in the Constitution or powers that were implied by the Constitution. I want to list some of the exact powers today that Congress has. That it's written in the Constitution that Congress can do these things. And the first one is the power to tax. The government has to have money to run, and so they have the power to tax. When the 16th Amendment was passed, that gave the federal government the power to collect income taxes. So not only are they taxing imports and exports, but they now are taxing the money that is made by Americans. The Congress has the power to borrow money from other countries. Congress has the power to make their own money. The Federal Reserve notes that we have has the power to declare war. That's very important that you understand that. Only Congress has the power to declare war. The president does not, the Supreme Court does not, states do not. Only Congress has that power. We talked about last week as well that the power to establish a post office. I know that seems kind of silly, but there's a post office in every town. And so it's important that you understand that. For many of you guys probably already know this one, the power of naturalization, the process of becoming a citizen, that is controlled by the federal government, controlled by the Constitution, really. The power of impeachment. Our current sitting president is one of only 3 presidents that have been impeached. We had a president, Andrew Johnson, who was impeached after the Civil War. We had Bill Clinton, who was impeached in the 90s, and then President Trump was impeached as well. All 3 of those cases, impeachment means you're charged with a crime in the House of Representatives, then it goes to the Senate to see whether you've been voted out. Not one of the people was voted out of office. So we have 3 presidents that were impeached, but none of them were removed from office. The Senate specifically has the power to approve treaties. So if a president goes and signs a treaty with another country, he has to bring it back to the Senate to be ratified, to be approved. And when that happens, then the treaty actually goes into effect. You might have learned in American history, after World War I, Woodrow Wilson had the Treaty of Versailles that he signed, but when he brought it back to the United States, the Senate wouldn't sign it for political reasons. And then, so the United States had to enter into separate agreements with all of the countries to determine the end of the war from the United States standpoint. All right. Little bit of change of subjects here. We are going to spend a week talking about how a bill becomes a law, but I'm kind of trying to introduce the little parts of it along the way so that when we get there, we can really go into depth about that process. We talked a little bit about what takes place in how an idea can become a bill and a bill sponsor. That can take place both in the House and the Senate, but for the sake of our argument, we're saying that a bill begins with the House of Representatives. When a bill gets to the Senate, it goes through the same thing, that it goes into committee, and if it makes it out of committee, then it can go to the Senate floor to be discussed by all the senators. The minority party who may want to kill a bill, like there's a bill literally they don't want to pass, they can try all kinds of tactics to try to get it so that bill can't get passed. And one of the most interesting ways that they can do it is something called a filibuster. A filibuster is just a member of it doesn't have to be a member of the opposite party. It could be a member of their own party, but somebody who who does not want a particular bill to be passed will literally sit up there and start to talk and keep talking. They can talk about anything. They can bring a phone book and read a phone book. We've had stories of people bringing out recipe books and reading recipes. They can say anything they want for as long as they want, because as long as they keep talking, the potential bill can't be voted on. So they're filibustering by talking. We've had filibusters go more than 24 hours where people sat there and talked for more, and you can't go to the bathroom, you can't get anything to eat, you have to sit there and talk for 24 hours. In the event that you want to try to stop a filibuster, the majority party can do something called a vote of cloture. And that just means that if you have a vote of cloture, you have to have 3/5 of the members of the Senate agree to this. So that means 60 people. 60 people have to agree to get this person to stop talking, and it really is only stopping them talking for 30 hours. But typically in that 30 hours, if someone is stopped, that 30 hours, the bill then will get voted on and get passed. So it is just a way to try to stop a bill from getting passed. In the event that once the House writes a version of the bill, the Senate writes a version of the bill, those bills are the same thing, they get sent to the president to potentially be signed into law. That's called a joint resolution. So the two sides come together, they have a resolution, a joint thing, they agree on it, it's given to the president. Some of the organizations of Congress as a whole, not just the Senate or the House, we talked about the first day of the House begins the first Monday in January. The Senate really doesn't have a first day because it's never stopped. Remember I said it's been going from 1789 to today. So it doesn't really have a formal beginning and end type thing the way that the House of Representatives does. What it does do, though, is that Congress as a whole empowers the President of the United States to come in once a year, usually January, February, to give a State of the Union address, the Union being the United States. And really, it's just the president going to say, this is a State of the United States. These are the things we're doing well. These are the things we're going to do better in the future. It's very funny when it happens. You can see how people stand up based on what party that they're in. There's all kinds of dynamics. The last State of the Union address, the Speaker of the House is a Democrat, the President's a Republican. They don't necessarily want to even shake hands when they're done. It's just an interesting soap opera to see. That is our government. That happens all the time. So it's just one of those things. I will tell you that we talked about committees last week. There are two types of committees. There's a standing committee, both in the House and the Senate are committees that are there all the time. They never can disappear. And then there are select committees. Select committees are committees that are put on a temporary basis, typically because there's a particular issue that want to be addressed. I could see if they wanted to, they could have started a select committee on how to deal with the coronavirus. We haven't done that, but that is something that potentially they could. So that's where we are for the notes for week 3. I will tell you that, again, we have about 14 words to answer. There is a short project to do, 3 questions to answer. What we're looking at is the interpretation of the Constitution, whether it should be interpreted very strictly or very liberally, meaning exactly what it says or what's the intent behind what it says. And then we have a quiz to take on Canvas, which you guys are more than familiar with. Hopefully we get back together this week. We will see by the time when I'm recording this, that's the plan, but that's 2 weeks from now, so we'll see what happens. Fingers crossed. Hope to see you guys soon.